on space walking. He is here around 8 o'clock. Dr. Brenner is a public health professor who works with the Westchester University Alcohol and Drug Prevention Program, and he will be joining us shortly. Then we have Zach Hoover, the Chief of Staff at the Office of State Senator Daylin Leach, and Executive Director of the State Judiciary Committee. Next, we've got Dr. Clyburn, a political science professor who focuses on racial and ethnic issues, and Dr. Reyes, a former probation officer, a senior parole officer, and a jail correctional officer, and professor of criminal justice at Westchester University. We're going to start by doing a brief introduction of the bill, if you would inform us on the actual bill language.
Sure. Again, my name is Zach Hoover. I'm Chief of Staff for State Senator Daylin Leach, who represents a district that has parts of Montgomery County and parts of Delaware County. I guess it was the day after Christmas, I was in Pittsburgh and woke up, and there was a story in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette with a quote from my boss saying that he was shortly going to introduce legislation to legalize marijuana in Pennsylvania. Usually he runs these things by me first. It was something he'd been talking about sort of behind the scenes for a while, and we knew we were going to write a bill and introduce it, but we hadn't even begun to contemplate the parameters of how it would work, how would marijuana legalization in Pennsylvania function. I mean, where would you be able to buy it? Who could buy it? How much you could buy it? Those sort of things. But immediately that's what everybody wanted to know, so we had to come up with something pretty quick. And what we came up with, I think, is a really good option for Pennsylvania where we are now. Just by way of background, for 75 years in Pennsylvania, we've pursued a policy option on marijuana that just makes no sense. Every year we spend $325 million on marijuana arrests, prosecutions, and incarcerations. And that's at a time when we're cutting education, where we don't have enough money to fix the bridges that we need. We've cut arts funding. We're talking about privatizing our state parks. And so we could really use that money that right now we're spending on marijuana cases. On the flip side, if we could regulate it safely and tax it, we'd be bringing in a whole bunch of money that we didn't have that we can spend on all those things that I talked about. Legalization of marijuana in Pennsylvania has created a whole system of street-level drug crime. It's the reason for a lot of the shootings that we have in our big and now small cities. It creates a system. Some people refer to marijuana as a gateway drug. There's not a lot of science that supports that idea, but we do believe that it creates a community where it's easier for somebody to get into harder drugs once they've gotten into marijuana. When you're meeting somebody behind a bowling alley to buy marijuana, and after the 5th time they say, I've got all this other stuff, would you like to try that too? It's probably more likely that they will. It also means that there's no way for us to regulate the safety of marijuana. So since we've embarked on this journey with this bill, we've heard from a lot of young people who tell us how much easier it is for them to get marijuana than it is for them to get alcohol. And if I had a kid who was interested in trying marijuana, I would want it to at least be a safe experience for them. But right now we have no way of knowing that the marijuana they get isn't laced with something else, or isn't somehow old or poisoned or something like that, which we think regulation would really help. So what our bill does is it would give the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board, which right now is the system that runs the state stores, that licenses bars and stuff like that, it would give them the exact same authority to regulate marijuana that right now it gives them for alcohol. So they would be in charge of regulating the growing of marijuana in Pennsylvania, the importation of marijuana to Pennsylvania, and they'd be selling it at our system of state stores. If you're over 21, you can go into a state store and buy marijuana. If you're over 21, you can have up to 8 plants of your own. And that's what our bill does. We're not married to that system, but for Pennsylvania, where we've already got a system that makes sure that our alcohol is safe and well regulated and that it's taxed, we think it makes sense to use it.
So we're going to sort of start our conversation by allowing each panelist to give their initial position on this bill, raising any questions or concerns about the bill, or any compliments as well, and we'll see how that progresses throughout this conversation and see what we come up with. I will speak on behalf of Dr. Brenner first. I do not endorse nor oppose PA Senate Bill 528. Like so many things in life, if this bill were passed and made law, I believe there would be some positive, and there would likely be negatives as well. Some positives include decreased assets, as well as incarceration, and increased revenue from taxation. Negatives include quality of life for some PA residents, particularly health and injury accidents. This bill is very straightforward and simple in its language, which is a strength, but the devil is in the details. Marijuana is a very complex plant and therefore also a very complex drug. The implementation of the legalization and sale of marijuana in Pennsylvania would create some very thorny public health and societal issues for Pennsylvania to wrestle with. A per se limit on marijuana use while driving would be one example of these issues. We can start with Dr. Reyes here.
Okay. When I worked in probation and parole, I worked in Camden for about 10 years. And the majority, if not all the people I supervised, were on probation and parole for drug usage, selling, or using marijuana, using other drugs. And quite honestly, I watched so many of my, I had a majority of male parolees and probationers on my caseload. I watched so many of them buying marijuana in the street in certain parts of Camden that, as Zach had mentioned, were laced with such things as the ashes from a bombing person and other chemicals. I never once saw, out of the hundreds of people I supervised, I never once saw any violent tendencies out of those individuals who were strictly using marijuana. And even personal experience, not that I was a user, but I was very close to somebody who was a marijuana user. He was never violent either with using marijuana. Now when he added the cocaine and the alcohol, yes, there were problems. My main concern with the legalization of marijuana, quite frankly, is I would love to see it regulated. I would love to make sure that those other chemicals are not being placed in the bags with the marijuana, and the people are smoking things they have no idea what they're doing. I believe in the tax revenue that would come in. I also believe that would increase the possibility for jobs. Quite frankly, granted, the people who are selling the drugs on the street might not be able to get the same amount of money they could on the street, but they would be the most knowledgeable people, in my opinion, to sell and know the most about the marijuana, because they're the ones who I quite honestly believe are the experts in the field. They know what they're selling. They know the difference between chronic and the regular weed and everything else. Now chronic, I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, is a much more potent version of marijuana, at least that we have in Camden. There were some issues with that because it seemed like it had different side effects for the people. But I honestly would say that this would be a good step in regulating what is actually being used in our state. However, my hesitation is, and I'm running for public office in Delaware County, this state is probably not going to pass it as a whole because it's still truly, in my opinion, a red state and very conservative. So it may have some issues with its progress through the system.
Thank you very much. Dr. Clyburn?
I can only echo her sentiments here with respect to the question of the benefits we could derive from taxing this product. Just imagine the enormous revenue this could generate for our state and for our republic as a whole if this were to become our national policy. The reality is the prohibition of marijuana, all it really has done is empower narcotics traffickers and endanger innocent people, as she astutely observed. If the product was regulated, and regulated by local, state, and federal authorities, the product may be less dangerous. Fewer lives would be endangered and jeopardized if the product could be taxed and regulated. I prefer not to use the term legalization. I prefer to say taxed and regulated. The reality is the current policy of prohibition has been an abysmal failure. There's no question about this. 100 million Americans insist that they have used marijuana, either past or present, for heaven's sake, and obviously the policy has failed. Equally important, prohibition has disproportionately impacted minority groups in the United States. Minorities represent only a relatively small percentage of marijuana users, but the vast majority of those who are arrested and prosecuted and incarcerated tend to be African Americans and Latinos. This is a policy prohibition that has disproportionately affected populations that already have to deal with poverty and other challenges. Why exacerbate these social problems and social maladies?
Yeah, we didn't introduce this bill because we think marijuana is really great and you guys should all do a lot more. As to the potential health risks of it, it's something that we are completely agnostic about. There's a lot of studies and a lot of smart people who say that there are significant health risks. There's a lot of smart people who've done studies that say there are not. We just don't think the government should be telling you one way or the other. Right now, there was one point that we would need to make sure that people who are high on marijuana can't drive. They can't. That's already law, and we wouldn't do anything to change that. I'm not sure I had anything else that you need to react to.
Okay, we'll get started with the questions. Also, if anyone has any questions throughout my question asking, feel free to interject. You can go ahead first.
Oh, I just wanted to point out, not a lot of people know this fact, but we often say, well, it's 75 years that we've been doing this prohibition. That's on a national level. When the federal government made cannabis illegal August 2nd, 1937. But Pennsylvania actually made it illegal a full 4 years before the national prohibition. Matter of fact, next month will be the 80-year anniversary. They passed a law in 1917 to ban opium and cocaine in Pennsylvania. And in 1933, that law was amended to include marijuana. They spelled it with an H, like marijuana, but that was in May 22nd, 1933. Now, where I'm from in Lancaster County, it's kind of interesting. The first person that we know of, anyway, that was arrested under the new Pennsylvania law was an 81-year-old man who was a hemp farmer. His name was Enos Schaefer. And Enos had a long strip of hemp growing along his garden. And he said that he admitted that he was growing it, but he said he had no idea whatsoever that it was illegal, because as far as he was concerned, he was growing it for hemp. He was growing it for seeds for his chickens to eat. And it was, so basically hemp was grown in Pennsylvania continuously from 1681 all the way up until past the years of Prohibition. This was July 5th, 1938, that Enos Schaefer was arrested in Lancaster. It's part of an ongoing investigation that they were doing into marijuana traffic, because even at that time, there were plenty of people growing it all over the place. Anyway, that's not a question, that's a statement.
I'm going to go ahead and start asking some of these questions so we can get things moving. Again, later on in the conversation, if anyone has any questions they'd like to bring up, just go ahead and raise your hand. First question, what challenges can this bill expect to face in the PA legislature?
Well, this is something that Dr. Reyes alluded to, that look, it's going to be an uphill battle. We joke in our office that if something's a good idea, Pennsylvania will pass it a day after Mississippi does. What I really think is that if we in the Senate had if we didn't have a public vote, if the senators didn't have to give their names when they voted, this bill would pass overwhelmingly.
Anonymous vote.
Yeah, an anonymous vote. It would pass overwhelmingly. And in fact, we've had a number of Republican members approach us and say, look, if I didn't have my crazy constituents to deal with, I would have no problem voting for this. Because every year they deal with the budget and they see just the amount of money that we're spending on this that we could be spending on other things. One prominent Republican told us that look, the only way that this would change his life is that he'd be able to smoke on his porch as opposed to his living room.
Oh my God.
But I mean, culturally, there are big swaths of Pennsylvania that are a little bit conservative, and I think people have a problem with this. And frankly, this is something you can speak to. Sometimes I do think there's a race component to that, or a rural versus urban component to that. It's seen as a problem in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but that's really no longer the case. More and more the cartels are moving into Pennsylvania's small cities and boroughs, places like Carlisle, Newark, Allentown, Bethlehem, Morristown. And violence is happening in places where it wasn't happening before. And arrests are being made in places where it wasn't happening before. And mostly it's because sometimes these places are along interstates, so they're convenient places to do a lot of compiling and dropping off. And as that changes, I mean, as this violence spills more and more into our more rural parts, I think that's going to start changing some minds about this failed policy. The governor also is a problem. He has said through a spokesperson that he would veto either a legalization bill or a medical marijuana bill. He referred to medical marijuana, which exists in 22 states, including the District of Columbia and many, many other nations, that medical marijuana still, he's concerned, is a gateway drug. So he's concerned that a 56-year-old man with cancer who gets a prescription from a doctor to smoke medical marijuana is just going to decide to get into heroin also, which we find hard to believe. I mean, it's an opinion, it's a policy that's not based on facts or data. It's just old wives' tales.
If you change the place of where they get it from the cities and that sort of thing, it takes most of the gateway effect out of it. I mean, honestly, because that's the truth. I mean, it's only where it's located where you get in that sort of stuff. Because believe me, I've done a lot of looking into a lot of different stuff. Sorry.
It's a good point.
My apologies, got hit and just like this thoughts of my brain.
Zachary here is certainly correct. The Republicans will be vehement in their opposition to this, but it is quite hypocritical considering that the governor and the House GOP recently, of course, approved liquor privatization, which will lead to more retailers than ever selling liquor products, and alcohol is clearly far more detrimental and harmful than marijuana. There's little question about this.
More people have died from it than marijuana.
Precisely.
I haven't heard one. I haven't heard one effect yet so far that anyone has died just from the use of marijuana.
So why is the GOP comfortable with Walmart or Costco selling alcohol, but somehow marijuana is unthinkable?
And I don't know. I've been trying to. The only thing that I haven't figured out right now so far has been the effects regarding farming and that sort of stuff, maybe privatization. I've been looking into this for actually 770 for medical use. I have no problem with the 520 legalization. They're both fine by me because honestly, I see more benefits than negatives.
Actually, according to the Drug Enforcement Administration, there has not been one single reported case of a marijuana overdose.
Right.
You can't overdose on marijuana. Overdose on marijuana, do you sleep?
I would love to. So you mentioned that this proposed legislation would establish the sale of marijuana through the state liquor stores, but wouldn't a privatization of some sort or a more private sector solution to this issue perhaps be favorable? I mean, certainly we could suppose that it would reduce criminal behavior, especially on areas of production or distribution. So could perhaps rather than selling it through this very regulated, and well, it would be regulated either way, but through this very top-down state-run store system, might not it make more sense to instead allow individual stores or persons to sell this regulated substance instead?
This is the option we went with when we wrote the bill. But what we found is really good is that I have conversations with other staffers in the capital of both parties who make the same argument to me. But we're having that conversation, which is really good. Yeah, I mean, right now the way our bill is written, all the growing and the importation would be done privately, and it would just be sold through the state stores. But I'm not, obviously if the state stores go away, we're gonna have to come up with something better,
Well-
or something different. We're not married to that idea.
I have a question for Dr. Reyes. In 2009, nearly 1.7 million people were arrested in the U.S. for nonviolent drug charges. More than half of those arrests were for marijuana possession alone. Less than 20% were for the sale or manufacture of a drug. What effects might this bill have on PA prison population and the prison budget, and how could this change the daily goals of law enforcement?
It would definitely decrease a lot of the prison overcrowding in the state. But truth be told, in the statewide system, the statewide prison systems, actually over 50% of the people who are housed in those facilities are in for violent crimes. It's the federal prisons who would actually be more impacted because it's over 50% of those inmates who are in there for drug offenses. So that would be something that would change the effect on both levels. Now, if we remove the people who are in there who are strictly in there for marijuana, yes, it would open up more bed space. But the correctional population inside the facilities has actually been going down since 2008. So the numbers have been declining. Now there are more people on the street under supervision under community corrections. That would have an impact on that side. But we would just have to wait and see how, if there are any other extenuating factors when people are being arrested, if it's just solely marijuana, it may make an impact, but if there are other extenuating circumstances, then they can still be incarcerated.
Want to elaborate on that question?
Just to note, I have a stat here that in 2007, there were 872,720 marijuana-related arrests in the United States. That is just a staggering number of people whose lives are being shattered, no matter what your perspective. And one could certainly argue that if marijuana is harmful or detrimental, well, incarceration is not known for someone's health. Quite frankly.
One thing I'd like to add too, I'm sure you guys have heard of drugsense.org. As of 4:06 p.m. today, there were 239,609 people arrested for cannabis alone in this country this year.
Wow.
So far this year.
Just-
Yeah, almost 240,000.
And I don't want to get too into this because it's a little bit off topic, but just to put the prison statistics in context, from 1940 to 1980 in Pennsylvania, that entire time, the population of the state prison system was between 8,000 and 12,000 people. Sometimes it went up, sometimes it went down, but it always hovered between 8,000 and 12,000. Beginning in 1980, when we started to get tough on crime and we started to say no to drugs, and we started lengthening sentences and making more things illegal. Since then, the prison population, again, 8,000 to 12,000, is now 48,000 people. A lot of them are geriatric prisoners. Between the federal system, between the state system, and between people who are out on the streets but are under supervision, there are 1 out of every 100 Pennsylvanians is under some sort of, I mean, just think about your high school graduating class. Like, that's a lot of people. And something that we experience all the time in the Judiciary Committee is somebody will bring a bill to us that says, you know, I'm running for re-election, and I really want to be able to say that I'm tough on crime. What's the penalty right now for beating up a bus driver? 6 years?
Let's make it 8.
Why don't we make it 8? And so they bring that bill, and just for 3 decades, those bills sailed through the legislature. So everybody could say, we're tough on crime, and if you decide to vote against it because you're just ideologically opposed to mandatory minimum sentences, you want judges to have discretion to enact their own sentences, then you're for people who beat up bus drivers when you run for re-election. Like they send that sort of stuff out. It utterly lacks common sense what we're doing. It might make us feel good sometimes, but it doesn't. It's lousy policy.
I saw a story online just a couple days ago, maybe within the last few days, and there was a conference, and I'm sorry I can't remember the person's name or his position, but he's in charge of the prison system in Pennsylvania.
It's probably Secretary Wetzel.
Okay, yeah, Wetzel, that's his name. And they had a big conference, and the title of the article was something about the status quo can't be maintained with the prison system. So there is discussion about that, and I went through, I heard those facts that you mentioned, and they were saying about the incredible growth. There was only a few prisons, now there's like 27 prisons. something like that. It's staggering.
I had a question, we did touch on it a minute ago, but the bill does mention the PLCB. I'm wondering, since privatization passed in the House, what you think, how the bill would change to adapt to if the Liquor Control Board is sort of their power. Because aren't they basically going to become obsolete if it's fully privatized?
There's a number of different bills out there. I mean, the one that would really affect our bill is that we would just sell all of the state stores to private companies and they would run them. If that happened, we'd have to think up something else. We'd sell marijuana at sheets or Walmart. Well, we'd figure it out.
If this were to pass and then the privatization were to pass after it, would we just adapt marijuana with alcohol, I guess? At the
Well,
same time?
I mean, it's very unlikely that that's going to happen. Privatization is going to either happen or not happen this year. Legalization of marijuana is certainly not going to happen this year.
Pardon me, but may I interject something? This is just a thought I had along with the other bill. But rather than that, why don't you have each town and each town committee take care of it and make it co-op per each town? So basically the towns can raise the money and the towns can pay. I mean, it would be a lot more co-op, a lot more, and people would know each other and be able to customize for, let's say, if it does get used for medical use also. I mean, you can have different strains, different stuff for everybody.
I don't think we would be against any plan that gets us the goal of legalizing marijuana.
Okay, so like a co-op basically with the town would be great.
Just like a quick specific question about like the details of the bill. You said that 8 marijuana plants per person would be allowed. Is that mature marijuana plants, or does that include clones and little tiny plants that might not make it to adulthood?
I have no idea.
I think every bill will at least say that, I thought it was 6 plants, by the way.
Flowering.
Yeah.
What'd you say, 3 flowering?
No, 6 plants and flowering, I thought.
Okay.
You could have other vegetative plants.
I see.
Yeah.
Never mind, 6.
I have that information. It actually says, possessing, growing, possessing, or transferring no more than 6 marijuana plants, with 3 or few being mature flowering plants.
There we go.
Oh,
That's it.
We base that on the idea that in Pennsylvania, you're allowed to make a certain amount of booze at home, if that's what you want to do. You can brew a certain amount of beer. I don't know exactly what it is off the top of my head, but so we wanted to give some people the ability to do that. If that's what
Upon the purchasing of marijuana, because it would still be federally illegal, would you take the name of the person purchasing marijuana, or is it just show my ID card if I'm over 21 and you just purchase that?
We wouldn't be taking anybody's name.
There wouldn't be any documentation or anything of how it was purchased.
You'd get a
anything
receipt.
That to be a receipt. Well, and I'm
Because you needed to return it. But no, I
This
mean,
feels a little
it's going to be really interesting to see what the feds do in Washington and in Colorado.
Yeah.
We want to think that they're going to respect the decisions of the voters in those states, but we'll see. This administration has been fairly progressive. We don't think progressive enough on this issue. If a more conservative administration came in, we don't know what we'll do. I mean, frankly, look, what we want is common sense national policy on this. It's going to happen state by state for a long time, and there's going to be either a piece of legislation in Congress or there's going to be a court case. But we really believe that legalization of marijuana is inevitable. If you look at the demographics and the way people who are younger feel about it, I mean, unless we all get old and cranky and crotchety and conservative, it just seems like it's something that's going to happen.
I would say too, someone else.
Yeah, do you see a system like Portugal's happening down the line where everything's just legal, which is regulated?
With harder
all
drugs?
drugs, yeah, in general.
I don't, but I have no idea.
Okay.
I mean,
Just opinions.
What people suggest to us all the time who are against this is, well, if Pennsylvania makes marijuana legal, then what's to stop us from making cocaine legal? And,
The uses of it?
well, I mean,
The fact is,
I mean, that's the slippery slope argument. I think it's almost always a bad argument. As policymakers and leaders, we're called on to make definite lines in the sand in a whole lot of issues. I mean, there's an established speed limit on the road. You can own a certain type of firearm. You can't you can't have a tank. I mean, these are decisions that we have to make as policymakers. And nobody's saying anywhere that I'm aware of in the United States, nobody in a position to introduce something is saying, let's make all drugs legal.
I never researched this, and I'm just curious. What does it mean for someone like who has had possession charges? What does that mean for? Do I like? I've been arrested for marijuana possession charges. It becomes legal. Does that still show up on my record?
It would have to show up before the law has been passed. It would still be on your record, I would believe. But then afterwards, depending if you don't violate the amount that you're allowed to have, then you shouldn't be arrested for it unless there's.
It's just like
possibly get it expunged.
I was going to say, your record
Yeah, I
would
don't know.
probably.
You'd probably have to get it expunged.
I don't know if it would.
I mean, even
I don't
without
know if
this.
Pennsylvania would do that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know like what happens, how that works retroactively. Like, it would just be kind of weird to live in a society then that it was legal and to apply for a job and just be like.
I know Daylin talks about, some people think that the bill should include amnesty, so that, let prisoners out. What Daylin says is that he doesn't want to do too much in the bill to get people opposed to it. Right away, people will think of the worst character that they can imagine and say he's going to come out and eat their babies. So he doesn't want to, but if the bill does pass, that pressure then will be on to get those prisoners out. But he's not necessarily going to introduce it with the bill.
Dr. Reyes, what are your thoughts on that, the concept of amnesty?
I really think that it would be a case-by-case situation. Again, as I mentioned before, if there are other factors involved, then I don't think there should be, say if there was a robbery involved or some other offense, even though some of the research says that if you take the drug usage out of the equation, there's no relationship with other criminal behavior with regard to marijuana usage. But then you hear, and Zach had mentioned earlier, other people saying, yes, there's a strong correlation between marijuana usage and every other type of crime. If it were just marijuana possession that would be protected under this bill, it could be a good idea. But again, I don't see it happening in the state. The current environment.
It's not something that we've thought of. Obviously, it's not part of the bill. I think right now when an individual uses marijuana, the worst thing that they're doing is supporting a violent black market. And that's not necessarily something that we want to get them off the hook for doing just because we decided to make this policy decision. I mean, when you decide to use marijuana, when you decide to buy it, you're supporting drug cartels. You kill people. And that's not necessarily something that we want to say, well, it's okay to choose that just because we made this policy change. But that's just off the top of my head.
Go ahead, Casey.
We're like everybody's saying, this isn't going to pass. This isn't going to pass. We're such a red state. It was a few years ago now, but National Geographic published a breakdown by race, by gender, by political identification. Nationally, about 60% of Republicans would support legalization. People who self-identified on a poll as Republican. And I was just wondering if, there's data on a state level about our, specific breed of Pennsylvania Republican. Because I feel like we anticipate a lot of conservatism and it might not be there.
See, I grew up in Indiana County, very conservative part of the state. So I saw a lot of that right-hand conservatism there. I can't see it passing on that part of the state anymore, at least that area.
And also, a lot of people who might be voting positive are in all the same districts.
Yeah.
As the constituencies that would be supported for all by the same politicians.
We also,
But again, even if the prospects are bleak at the moment, that doesn't mean that this discussion is meaningless or pointless. How many civil rights bills were introduced in the US Congress and elsewhere prior to actual reform and civil rights actually taking effect? The discussion is necessary for eventual change.
And there was a poll 2 weeks ago, and I forget who did it, so I can't speak to its accuracy, but 88% of Pennsylvanians support it. 88% of Pennsylvanians in this poll identified as supporting marijuana, and yet it's a non-starter for the government.
Dr. Clyburn, to continue on what you were speaking of, do you think that this bill is arriving prematurely? And if so, what changes do you think we need to see in Pennsylvania before the bill would pass?
Wow, oh, that's a burning question. No question about it. If, for example, if Governor Corbett were to happen to be defeated for re-election next year by a Democrat, the prospects undoubtedly would improve. Or if the Republicans were to, say, lose control of the House and Senate, not likely, I would say at the moment, but who knows? If these things were to occur, perhaps the climate would be more favorable if the Democratic Party were to capture the governor's mansion. If Allison Swartz, for example, were to, but that's a question. What about candidates like Allison Swartz and others who are contemplating running for the governorship? What is their position on this issue at the moment?
And that's one of the great things about just having a bill out there, is that now, because there's a bill, somebody running for governor is going to be asked what they would do, which that would not be the case, or it certainly wasn't the case 4 years ago.
No doubt about it.
Is there some kind of process for putting it on a ballot? You know, instead of letting the bill pass, but you know, some way of letting the people actually vote on it?
Sure. Pennsylvania doesn't really have a system of referendum, unlike a place like California. So, unfortunately, not.
Pardon me, but
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Your main promotion for this bill, is it just like purely economic reasons, or are you promoting more than just economic reasons for like the reason for why we should pass this bill?
Well,
Before you, I
Yeah.
guess, because there's also like, there's a lot of other reasons why growing of hemp would be good for Pennsylvania. For instance, like.
nobody knows more about this than I do.
I was gonna say, so I mean, like, in order to maybe sway, instead of just saying like it's for like legalization of marijuana or something like that, like we need to promote the benefits of hemp insulation, building houses, like anything like that. I think that might be a way to help the conservative part of this state.
And there are a lot of conservatives that on this issue, who are conservative voters, but who on this issue are kind of libertarian. I mean, they don't think, maybe they aren't users themselves, but they don't want the government to tell them that they can't do it. And that's a lot of Republican members who have talked to Daylin about saying, look, if I didn't have to run for re-election, I'd be happy to support this. It's because they just don't think the government should be involved.
okay, well, pardon me, I'm going to add on to her subject. Basically, promotion and that sort of thing. Now, we're the economy in the way it is right now. Why can't we take a look at it and say, have somebody put together, okay, this much we can put into that and make it an actual industry, and actually say, okay, we can get 10,000 jobs in Pennsylvania because of not only the growing, but the testing, and then the sale on that sort of aspect. Because if we want to get a standard, which we're already creating standards in California, Washington, and Colorado, we can just adapt those standards over to here. I mean, is there anybody doing a study of that, so we can maybe run it by the Republicans and say, hey, you know what, we can get you more jobs, we can get more taxes and all this sort of stuff, but this is how it needs to be done, slowly but surely. Would that work?
I think it would be very helpful.
Is there anyone out there who's done a study regarding that, or
Not that I'm aware of. We would need funding to do something like that. It's not something that our office is equipped to do. If there was like an industrious political science professor somewhere who wanted to get a bunch of students, something like that.
Yes, the economic impact of this is a burning question about
because not only that, but you can also say, okay, you got the bill out there, which can create more jobs, get more taxes and all that sort of stuff. Focus on that rather than the legalization aspect.
Well, because pretty much.
Yeah,
That's what we are focusing on.
I mean, to push them, is there any way at all that you can maybe get us on the vote?
Go violate the rules of the Senate.
I'm gonna jump over to chats, and then I've just got a lot of hands to mouth.
Alright, so there's been a lot of discussion of some of the benefits that legalization might have, but what will legalization mean for the some of the at-risk members of our society? Will my children be safe?
Well, we think it'll make it harder to get it. I mean, if we destroy the street level market for marijuana, and we're only selling it in state-run and regulated stores, you know, again, this is anecdotal evidence that I get, but we hear from young people all the time, high school students and some college students who say it's much easier for them to get marijuana than it is for them to get out. It's because they have to go to a store that's run by the state to buy a bottle of Bacardi. You know, I can't tell you for sure, but you know, we think that legalizing marijuana would kind of cripple some of the drug cartels. We think that regulating it would make it a safer product for people to use. We think street level violence would go down, and we think it would be harder for young people.
Is the present day system or approach enhancing your children's safety? Is the question I would ask. Is incarcerating a recreational user and by doing so turning them into a hardened criminal, is that enhancing the safety of young people and average everyday families? Turning recreational users into hardened criminals or prison gang members or perhaps some skinhead gang member, is that somehow enhancing our safety?
Well, I think the benefit of the current system is that things like mandatory minimum sentences, although they certainly have their issues, provide a strong incentive for children to think long and hard before they decide to partake in criminal activity.
Yeah, right. Pardon me, do you live in Fairyland? Is this Disneyland?
Hi, thanks. My name's Brenner. Sorry I came in a little bit late. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, really. I don't disagree with those two perspectives. I'll just throw in a little, some more food for thought, I guess. And as I said in my opening statement, and you know, I think the devil's in the details. And so, while again, I don't really disagree, let's just say a state-run store had a few varieties, or even 25 different varieties. But this stuff that I could get from British Columbia, which is the best stuff ever, because my friends from Washington are telling me all about it, and I can't get it in a state-run store. It still may have some street value then, which may not eliminate completely those kinds of things. So, there is, again, I don't disagree, but at the same time, there might be still some other values and other ways to get, product that you can't get in a state-run store that may kind of keep some of the, more criminal aspects of this alive to some extent. Not, certainly we would be diminished, but not necessarily completely absent.
Well, has that shown to be the case, do you know, in like Amsterdam and Portugal and things like that? Because
hard for me to comment. And again, I don't know, again, the devil's in the detail. So we can have, if we have state-run stores that have every variety under the sun, then, then it won't be an issue. But
and I
maybe
mean,
they
like,
only
this is
decide to
one
have 5
person's
varieties. I don't
perspective,
know.
but like, been to Amsterdam did not seem like that mentality at all.
That's not legal in Amsterdam.
You can get
in the coffee shop.
get
It's not
everything in the
legal.
coffee shops. I mean, you're not like looking the streets for some guy's stuff because it's available.
But there is still a street aspect and a still criminal aspect in Amsterdam, even though you can get it in those coffee shops and whatnot, because they're the only places it's legal.
I think the only way that it would benefit the gangs and that sort of stuff is if we started pricing it way too high and that sort of stuff. I mean, if it came at like a relative, like with tax 150, that sort of stuff for now. So I think Lincoln would be that.
Which brings up a question I have. I've heard Daylin speak plenty of times, and I thought I understood him to say that the bill does not set a tax rate. I admit that I didn't study every sentence of the bill yet, but somewhere today or yesterday I read that it does set a tax rate. Does it or does it not? I'm not not sure.
No, it leaves it to the,
Because I think on the events
LCG.
page for this, they had something about a tax, maybe it wasn't here that I saw it, I'm not sure.
That was
it's not an element.
Oh, predicted revenue, okay. But to be clear, the bill does not establish a tax, okay.
We had a question in the back, I think.
Yeah, first thank you panelists for being here this evening. It just started thunderstorming. But I had a quick question. Just if anyone could speak to kind of the similarities and differences of this conversation with many of the conversations that are happening on the East Coast as opposed to the West Coast. And then also, we started to bring in some international viewpoints. So if you can kind of speak to that.
I'm sorry, can you say the second?
It's just bringing in different viewpoints as opposed to like the West Coast, East Coast. We talked about just 2 seconds ago, Washington State, British Columbia, and then also, some of the international players and how that kind of ties in.
And in other words, I guess, how does this bill maybe differ from the ones that were recently passed in Colorado and Washington?
Oh, I have no idea.
I think it's very similar to the one in
Yes.
Colorado.
It's very similar.
It was modeled after Colorado.
And Washington's considered state.
very similar. As far as foreign countries, as some of my students may know, I've lived in Western Europe for much of my adult life. And again, in Holland, for example, many narcotics like marijuana are legal, and crime is significantly less than what you find here in the United States. So are rates of drug addiction and other serious social maladies. Well, quite frankly, the same could be said of prostitution, which is legal in many Western European countries, but is not as popular and not as frequented as it is here in the United States. So if you were to compare and contrast our societies, legalization, or whatever term you choose to use, doesn't seem, based on the models of other Western countries, to give rise to increases in drug addiction or drug use or in crime rates.
I wanted to comment on the hemp issue. It's something we've all to deal with it. And by far, I'm not a fan of Mitch McConnell at all. But I did read a small article about him promoting hemp farming, and that's an incredible shocker, period, for me. But because
I think he's trying to just get votes.
Yeah, well, wanted a way to boost the economy, and I know we are an incredibly rural state, and I'm wondering, is there any sort of group of representatives who are kind of like an inner congressional lobby for the farming industry in Pennsylvania? And maybe I'm just kind of suggesting, if it is a significant group, hey, look, hemp, and since we're not doing anything about natural gas right now, bigger industry.
I'm from Lancaster County, and we've been working on the hemp issue for at least 16 years, if not more. And back in 1999 and again in 2000, we had the local Lancaster Farm Bureau pass resolutions in favor of hemp. They took it to the Pennsylvania State Farm Bureau, and in November of 2000, they passed a resolution in favor of hemp. The Pennsylvania Farmers Union passed resolutions in favor of hemp, and so did Pennsylvania State Grange. But it hasn't transferred into any kind of legislative support. My local representative is State Senator Mike Brubaker, and at a town hall meeting, I talked to him. Well, actually, I knew him before he was a state senator when he worked with Brubaker's Agronomic Consulting Service, and I gave him a lot of information way back in 1998. And then I saw him periodically through the years at different planning commissions and so forth. And now he's a state senator. So at the recent town hall meeting, I talked to him about hemp and gave him a 2.5-minute spiel in front of everybody. He said he totally supports hemp. He's 100% for it, but he stopped short of saying that he will introduce a bill. So as far as I know, it doesn't really register much of a blip on the political radar screen.
It could be another, sort
I
of
mean, I was hired by Penn State Department of Agricultural Economics and Rural Sociology. We went to over 400 farms in Lancaster County, many of them old order Amish and old order Mennonites, and a few not so. And we gauged a lot of agricultural questions, and we asked them specifically about their knowledge, support, and awareness of hemp, and if they'd be willing to grow it. And a large percentage of those people either said they knew about it and they would grow it, or they're curious about it, want to know about it, or they would be inclined to grow it if their neighbors grew it. So there is plenty of support. We've had different meetings in Lancaster County where we brought a hemp farmer from Canada. He talked to at least 100 local farmers. This was back when we were building the support to get these resolutions passed, but it hasn't translated at all into political and legislative support.
Dr. Brenner, I'm conceiving a loaded question for you. One of the highest priorities in Pennsylvania is education. If this bill were to pass, how could we incorporate proper marijuana education into the classroom, and how would the paradigm shift?
So how long is this, Pat? Discussion.
About 30 seconds.
I guess I'll start out by saying I really, I don't think we do a really good job of drug education in general, as a rule. So that is the backdrop. I think actually, I'll use a metaphor a little bit. How many of us were taught how to drink alcohol? And I mean that seriously, because we're never taught. We learn by experience. We learn from what we see, that sort of thing. And I think that's a tremendous weakness and fault of, in this case, drug education. In many cases, the argument is they're not allowed to drink because they're not 21, so we don't need to talk about it, and that's crap. So I think similarly, when we're talking about marijuana, my philosophical slant on this is that we're really talking about, when you think about drug education, this is the way I think about it, we're talking tobacco, marijuana, and alcohol are really, there's enough sort of perceived benefit and perceived lack of harm for those three that we need to treat them differently than I think most other drugs like meth and cocaine and ecstasy and that kind of stuff. So that would be money, and enhancing education for really those three particularly. But we have to talk about all drugs, and I think we need to do a much better job of that just in general. So I hope that, without taking up the rest of the time.
Dr. Clyburn, this is more for you, but please anyone weigh in. If a constituent is in support of this bill, how can they tell their local representatives about it in an effective way without avoiding any sort of social stigma?
Well, if you have poll data of any kind, above all else, cite poll data. Cite the fact that vast numbers of people support such legislation and support this idea. As Zach has suggested here, that's a way to influence people, citing stats of this kind. Also cite other figures and statistics, always. For example, in 2007 alone, our government spent $42 billion on marijuana prohibition alone. That is a staggering sum of money to expend at this point. And then there's another danger that Zach noted here, and that's the danger posed by these various drug cartels. All that marijuana prohibition really does is really strengthen these criminal organizations that decapitate innocent people, that have destabilized Mexico and turned it into essentially a failed state for all intents and purposes. Why do we want to pursue a public policy that is really only favors malefactors and lawbreakers and criminals? Why? Individuals who are exploiting other people, individuals who are literally invading our communities even as we speak. Point to the dangers of prohibition, along with the popular support that it enjoys.
Thank you very much for that. Did anyone other panelists want to weigh in?
I mean, absolutely. I hesitate to say this because it's going to sound weird, but don't sound like a marijuana user when you call. Since Daylin's introduced this bill, we've had more phone calls from people who go, "Hey, you introduced a marijuana bill?" And we go, yes, we did. So is that law now? And you go, no. And they go, oh, well, I'm for that. We get a lot of those phone calls. I assume it's like right after The Price is Right. So just be informed. I mean, mention all of these things. There's so many good reasons to do this other than just wanting to use marijuana. Talk about those reasons. We can give more money for things that your representatives really care about. Find out what they care about. I mean, if they care about more money for animal shelters in their district, say this is going to be more money for animal shelters in your district. That's the best way, I think,
And so everyone here is aware, we have pre-written letters to 3 different senators in the back of the room, along with envelopes and stamps and addresses. Please fill one out, sign it, write whatever senator you would like to have it sent to. We have, pre-addressed, and put your return address on it, and we will send it out for you. In order to sort of wrap up, I would like to, starting with you, Dr. Reyes, go down the line. What do you think Senate Bill 528 can mean for Pennsylvania?
I think it could definitely mean more revenue and more, the regulation could help the primaries. That's just it.
Medical marijuana is frequently utilized in terms of combating cancer, in terms of combating HIV and AIDS, and other serious medical conditions. There are innocent people who are afflicted with serious medical conditions. Why do we want to deprive them access to a product that could benefit them in some way, shape, or form? That sounds rather callous and hard-hearted from my standpoint.
I think it'll mean less money spent on this failed policy. I think it'll mean more money for really worthy projects, things that are going to make Pennsylvania a better place to live and work and raise a family. I think it's going to be less lives shattered by having to spend time in jails for something that's really not hurting anybody, and therefore making it harder to get into a place like Westchester or get a job. I think it's going to mean safer streets. And I would urge you guys, if you can, to reach out to your senators and representatives.
So I was hoping we were going longer. I think it's a mixed bag. I don't, as I sort of indicated in my, and again, I don't want to take away from the positives. I think there will be positives from it, but I also think that it's, the devil's in the details. It's not all going to be wonderful rainbows and unicorns. I think with this kind of deal, it creates some positives, but it also creates things around DUI. It creates some issues around, there's a tremendous amount of public service workers who I don't think you want under the influence of marijuana when they're driving your train, flying your plane, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when I think about this, one of the things that I think about is, all right, so if we're going to legalize this drug, then, the NIAAA, which is the National Institute on Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse, recommends for alcohol, for a male, no more than 2 drinks per day, and no more than 1 for a female. So what's moderate marijuana use? What would we recommend for legalizing this, and when does that happen?
Quarter for a male.
Right. And so what percent THC are we talking about? Right? So you start to dice it up.
15%.
Well, right. So you start to dice it up and it gets complicated. And I think that's ultimately where I am, is that it's complicated. And so we need to be really thoughtful and take it slowly on some level when addressing this, thinking about it, creating laws and policies and procedures about how we handle that kind of stuff.
I'd like to thank all of our panelists. It was a wonderful discussion.